All right. We are diving in this morning to the season of Epiphany, uh, one of the lesser known church calendar seasons of the year. You may recognize Advent from your chocolate Advent calendars, and you may recognize Christmas, pretty popular, Lent for giving up that chocolate, and Easter. These are all seasons of the church calendar that we're quite familiar with. Epiphany doesn't get quite as much airtime, but just a little bit of context of where this fits in the church calendar. The church calendar actually begins, the church year begins with the beginning of Advent, usually right at the end of November, beginning of December. It's a season of anticipation, a season of preparing for God's arrival, God's coming. And then Advent culminates in Christmas, which in the church calendar is not a day. There is Christmas Day, but Christmas is really a season as well. You may know from the 12 Days of Christmas, that song, that's a real thing. The church celebrates Christmas for 12 days in a season called Christmastide. And that is really about focusing and celebrating the incarnation, the arrival of Christ. And then on January 6th, which was yesterday, the church begins the season of Epiphany. And you may think of Epiphany as like, oh, I had an epiphany. That's exactly what Epiphany means. Epiphany comes from the Greek word for manifestation. The idea that there was something always there, always hidden in plain sight, but now you see it. Now the light turns on. And so there are three events that the church really typically focuses on in this season of Epiphany, at least within the scriptures. The first is the story of the Magi, this appearing of the light of Christ to the Gentiles. And then always included as well is the baptism of Christ, which is this appearing, this light turning on to the nation of Israel, that this is God's chosen and anointed one, this is the Messiah. And then also included usually are the wedding at Cana and the transfiguration, this revealing, this really magnificent, amazing display of God's glory to the disciples. And so we're going to stay in Epiphany for the Epiphany season for these 6 weeks leading up to Lent. And we're going to stay in this place of paying attention to the life of Christ. Epiphany is always associated as well with the theme of light. This idea of manifestation is really the revealing of what's always been there, and it's best kind of understood within the metaphor of darkness and light. I wonder if you've ever had like a trip to the beach, and you've set out after dark, or maybe on your way there, the sun goes down, and you arrive to the beach, and you arrive to that beach house late at night, and it's dark. Have you ever had this happen to you? And you get there, and you open the car door, and you can hear the sound of the waves. And you can smell this distinct difference in the air, right? You can smell the air coming off of the salt of the sea. It's just different, right? And you know you're at the sea. And maybe you have the ability with where you're situated to walk out on the beach or to look out at the view, and you can see maybe just a white ripple or two, and you know the ocean's there, but you can't see much of it. It's one of my favorite things to and there's great mystery. I mean, this could be true of anywhere you go at night, really, right? For the first time, a place that you go at night for the first time, and you're like, I have no idea where I am. And then you wake up in the morning, and you look out, and even though you've seen the ocean before, you could not imagine the view that you wake up to. This is the idea of Epiphany. It's a turning on of the light, the revealing of God's glory in the face of Christ. And so this is a season to pay attention to what God's showing us in Christ, and particularly in these places where God where his glory is shining like a light. So it's really interesting. I came across this detail this week listening to somebody talk about Epiphany. In the Western church, icons are full, religious icons are full of halos. Everybody has a halo, right, when you look at the images. If you look at this image of the Last Supper, this is an icon from the Western Church, like Roman Catholicism. And halos in Western iconography are used kind of like white hats and black hats in old Western movies. They're ways of kind of identifying like who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And you notice there's one guy that doesn't have a halo. Who is he? I wonder who he is. But in the Eastern tradition, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, icons are used differently. Look at this depiction of the Last Supper in an Eastern icon. Halos in the Eastern tradition were used to differentiate between those who got it and those who didn't. And so this iconographer is depicting how the disciples at this point in the story are very much still in the dark. They don't see what's really right in front of them. They're not in a place of perceiving what's actually going on. In animation, there's this trope, right? When a character finally realizes what's going on or what they have to do, when they have an epiphany, something appears above their head, right? They get this light bulb. They get an idea. Ding, and then there's usually like a ding, right? And that's kind of how the halos work within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, right? Look at this icon of the crucifixion from the Eastern tradition. Why does the Roman soldier have a halo? Not because he's particularly a good guy. He has just participated in the crucifixion of Jesus. He's just nailed Jesus to a cross. So this isn't a picture of his holiness. The idea here is that the light bulb has just gone off for him. He's had an epiphany. He's realized the thing that was hiding in plain sight. And we know his words, surely this man was the Son of God. Ding. So this is what the season of Epiphany is all about. It's about light shining into dark places, illuminating darkness, showing people the truth of what's been here all along, and it's about the light bulb turning on. And so we're going to be paying attention to these stories and seeing people coming to this truth of the light of God revealed to us in Jesus. So we're going to begin at the beginning of Epiphany with this text from Matthew 2. It's a text I've preached actually like 3 years in a row now on this Sunday. And as you can imagine, it gets challenging to come at some of this stuff with a fresh take. But we're going to spend a little bit of time in this passage and see what God has for us. So we're going to begin Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and I'll have it up here on the screen. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this news, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you have found him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So all this is taking place during the time of King Herod. We immediately kind of get placed right into the context. Herod's not a good guy. He's power hungry. He's paranoid. He's From what we know of his architecture and the work that he did, he was brilliant, but he was also a tyrant. At this point in the story, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus have not traveled back to Nazareth, which was their home. They've decided to stay in Bethlehem. And maybe that's because to go back to Nazareth is to kind of return to scandal. Here's this child kind of born out of wedlock. It could be that in Bethlehem they are receiving support from Joseph's side of the family. We know it's where his family was from. Bethlehem's also kind of like a nice suburb of Jerusalem, about 7 miles away. Kind of that context of that 7 miles. I know I talk about it frequently, but just for us to place ourselves spatially, this is from Union Chapel to Legacy Salmon Creek. That's 7 miles. That's how far it is from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. And they're living here in the shadow of King Herod, who I said is a bad dude. He, very paranoid, has killed multiple children, killed his own wife as well. Anyone that he felt and sensed a threat to usurping his power, he just did away with. And Herod was a bit of a polarizing figure for the Jews. He was a puppet king for Rome. So Rome is ruling in this area, and they've placed Herod over the Jewish people. And Herod knew how to play the politics of being in this space. And he knew the way to keep the Jewish religious elites in his pocket was by rebuilding their temple. And so he puts an immense amount of work into that. And he seeks to establish Israel's power in this region. So while the Jews hated his lavish lifestyle and his lack of morals, they also kind of needed him to get to their own purposes. But Herod, by definition, is kind of an anti-Messiah. He does not honor God. He does not honor God's people. He's not shepherding God's people. He only seeks his own fame and power. And his paranoia about keeping that power eventually consumes him all the way to his deathbed. So this is the context into which Jesus is born. So in the days of King Herod, right? And then we see early on in this passage, let me get back there, Magi from the east come to Jerusalem. Magi is kind of the word where we get the word magicians from. It's got connections kind of to Eastern concepts of wise men, astronomers, or astronomers are people who study the stars, but also astrologers, which is not necessarily, we don't look at those as sciences, as both sciences today. We'd say astronomy, science, astrology, not so much, right? But in the ancient world, those were very connected. You'd study the stars and their movements and map them and chart them, but astrology is gaining meaning from that. What does this mean? This is deeply connected to what is going on here. And so we know that these are people that are paying attention. They're learned people. These are not Jews. They're not from Israel. They're pilgrims and wanderers drawn by the light of a star. And we really don't know anything about them. We only know the direction that they've come from. There's lots of fun ideas about where potentially these guys came from. Were they from Babylon? Did they have scriptures that Daniel and the exiles left behind that they discovered? Were they studying these scriptures, and then when the stars appear, they kind of connect that this is a Jewish Messiah? There's a whole bunch of ideas as to how they got here. But we aren't told how they put it all together. All we do know is that they've seen this star, and they believe the star signifies the birth of Israel's king, and they've laid everything on the line to journey and find this king of the Jews. It's important for us to remember this is not like a hobby horse excursion. Right? This is a risking life and death. This is a very costly journey. We like to think about 3 wise men. This is not a journey you would take in threes. The scripture never says that there were 3. We get that because there's 3 gifts, and there's kind of some there's an ancient tradition that tells us there's 3 and there's names for them and all of this. But within the scripture, we just say Magi. This could have been a very large caravan of people. Even if it was 1 or 2 people who were really interested in this trip, they would have had to bring a whole bunch of support with them in order to make this journey. And why are they doing this? You only do something like this if you have a deep sense that there's something meaningful to find at the end of the journey. And so we meet these guys, and they've arrived in Jerusalem, and they've come to the end of their knowledge, right? It's gotten them this far. If there's going to be a king in Israel, he's going to be in Jerusalem. So we'll come to Jerusalem, and we'll start asking around. This is what a seeker does when they come to the end of their knowledge. They ask questions. And so they say, where's the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star. We've come to worship him. And Herod catches wind of this caravan and these king seekers, and his immediate response is anxiety. And then his anxiety spreads to all of Jerusalem. And all of Jerusalem is troubled with him, right? So much anxiety. Because it's never good when a paranoid tyrant feels threatened. It's not good for anybody. And they know this. So Herod's not stoked about the idea that these people are here, and he decides to do some research of his own. So he calls in the learned men, the chief priests, and the people of the law, and he says, where is this king to be born? And they say, Bethlehem. That's what the prophets foretold. So he pulls the Magi in for a little dinner party. And he wines them and he dines them. He says, look, I think I know where you need to go. You should go to Bethlehem. This is what all my guys are saying. You should go to Bethlehem. That's where you'll find him. Please let us know where you found him, because I'd like to come and worship him as well. And we know this is not his intention. In fact, we're not going to read this portion, but when he realizes later that he's been duped by the Magi, he orders the murder of all of the young boys beneath the age of 3 in Bethlehem. Like I said, just not a good dude. Not a part of the story we like to tell at Christmas time either. This idea that Jesus was born in this place and people had to die for Jesus before he died for them. So Herod sends the Magi on their way. And they take off for Bethlehem. Remember, this is just a 7-mile journey. Keeping in mind how far they've come, they're probably like, great, only 7 miles to go. We're almost there. And as they're walking, the star appears to them again and seems to settle over the place where Jesus was. And they are freaking excited. It's hard to see in the text, but this idea that when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Right? This journey that they had set out on, they're about to arrive at the aim of their entire journey. Arrival is right here. And on coming to the house, they see the child with Mary. And what do? Their response is immediate worship. They bow down and worship him. I wonder if you're Mary in this scenario. We have to mess with our internal nativity scenes a little bit here, right? Because we stare at the pictures all the time, and it's Jesus in the stable with the manger. And if I could go into it, I'd love to just kind of destroy your nativity set for you of all the reasons why it doesn't work. But we have the shepherds, and then the Magi are all there with baby Jesus on the night of his birth, and that's very much not what's going on here. This is somewhere between at least 40 days, maybe we know by Herod murdering 3-year-olds and younger, it could be as much as 3 years later. And if you're Mary, what is this like? You're chasing around a little toddler Jesus, trying to get him ready for bed, because they can see the star, so sun's gone down. And all of a sudden, this caravan shows up at your doorstep. And when they see your son, they all get down off of their camels and fall on their faces in front of your toddler. And if that's not enough, they begin to bring out these treasures fit for a king. Gold, frankincense, myrrh, all extremely costly and have strong connections to royalty and priesthood. And we know if a decent amount of time has passed here, the ordinariness of life is probably starting to set in for Mary and Joseph and Jesus. A little bit. First-time parents, it's hard. But my guess is that night with the shepherds is kind of dwindling in your memory, right? And you're just doing life with a toddler, which is exhausting. And then these guys show up. It would have been absolutely overwhelming. So what's the significance of this passage for the season of Epiphany? This story just usually gets lumped in with Christmas. The Magi are just part of the nativity scene. But the significance of this passage is really worth dwelling on. First, for some help, I want to just go back to Isaiah 60. Isaiah is where we spent our Advent season, and this is actually the passage that is connected with the Matthew 2 reading, this Matthew 2 reading in the lectionary for the Feast of Epiphany. And so this is what Isaiah 60 says. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look about you. All assemble and come to you. Your sons come from afar, and your daughters are carried on the hip. Then you will look and be radiant. Your heart will throb and swell with joy. The wealth on the seas will be brought to you. To you the riches of the nations will come. Herds of camels will cover your land, young camels of Midian and Ephah, and all from Sheba will come, bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord. This is written a long time before this happening. So a little bit of the context here. This prophecy is written by the second school of Isaiah. So Isaiah has passed away, and these disciples have likely continued with his writing and in his school. And for context here, the Israelites have, when this is written, the Israelites have returned from Babylon, and they've come back to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is in rubble. And they're trying to rebuild what they had, but it's not anything like what they had. There is no temple. There is no, and even when they do get a temple rebuilt, it makes people cry. The people who remember what the old temple looked like all weep, because it's nothing of its former glory. And God's presence doesn't come back and dwell in the temple. And there's all of this infighting and it is dark. They're feeling this right here, the darkness covering the earth and the thick darkness over the peoples. Right? They are sitting in this darkness, and this prophecy comes to Isaiah, says, "Get up, look up. The Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you." And the prophet says, nations will come to your light, and these foreigners will come with camels and gold and incense, and they'll proclaim the praises of the Lord. Now, in terms of like biblical hermeneutics here, in terms of interpreting this passage, we don't necessarily get to go, this is all one-to-one, that this is all just completely fulfilled here in this space. In Isaiah, they're referencing here the idea that God's city, that Zion, that God's people will one day shine, and that eventually all of the nations will come and return as well. And so there's the sense that this is still yet to be fulfilled. But we look at this passage and we get this feeling along with them. It's kind of a head-scratching thing. This light is shining in the midst of God's people, there in the place that God said his good shepherd would be born. And kind of going back to Matthew now, we see these characters. We see Herod, we see the teachers of the law, and the people who should be expecting this arrival of Jesus. And who is it that's seeing the light? Who sees it? It's the Gentiles that see it. It's the people on the outside, not even Jewish people. They're the ones that realize the significance of the birth of Christ. They're the ones that see the light in the night sky and follow it to the place where it rests. The outsiders will be drawn to it and brought in, and that is very much what the prophet Isaiah is speaking about here. The nations will come and be drawn, and they'll bring their gifts of gold and incense. I think what I love about Epiphany, as a non-Jewish person myself, is that it begins in this place of my spiritual heritage, and very likely your spiritual heritage too. Because we're not Jews awaiting a Messiah. Our spiritual heritage is actually with these outsiders, with these people who see from afar, and they've seen a light and they've been drawn to it. I step back from this story, and I think what continues to just spur my imagination in general is the idea that these people were so captivated with something. They were so drawn that they had to go on a journey with absolutely no guarantees. And who's to say that they would even find anything of substance in the end, right? They're heading out into this unknown, not even from a context of their own faith experience, heading into the unknown because God's leading them somewhere. And I think when I step back and look at this, I think the question I ask is like, does this still happen today? Is God still calling people to himself, people from afar? Is God drawing people from far off places? I came across an article last month, and it was more of an essay, really. It was really long. I was finding my millennial social media cultured self like, wow, this is really long. This is like more than 40 words. And it was just a simple article on faith in the state of faith in America, and I was like, who is writing this article? And so I went to look at who was writing the article, and I didn't recognize them, and I was like, who is this guy? And come to find out, his name is Paul Kingsnorth, and I found his website, and I found like he was a former editor for this major publication, and I start to see little bits and pieces about his story, and then I find his full story. He's written another very long and lengthy essay, which I don't have time to read to you, but I'm going to summarize for you in a minute, about his own spiritual journey. And I think Paul is a bit of a modern-day Magi. He was born in southern England in 1972, so that makes him, 52. Turning 52 this year, okay? So context, still alive, this person, and born in southern England, son of a working class family, and his father was an atheist, and so he just naturally followed suit. And even though he was an atheist, he admits that he always loved going into old churches, not because he believed in God, but because there was some kind of seriousness to it, something of mystery and wonder. But his earliest memories of the church were not of attending. Instead, he and his schoolmates would sneak into this old Anglican church once a week just to write in the visitor's book, just this book sitting right at the front, like for guests and people who would come in, right? And they'd find notes, things like, this is such a beautiful building, or I find so much peace when I'm here. And he and his friends would go to the visitor's book, and they would write things like, I will destroy you and all of your works, ha, 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 and then sign it Satan, in all caps. And then he said one time they went in and wrote, die Nazarene, victory is mine. I mean, like, this was his kind of first encounters with church. He does admit that he and his friends had been watching a bunch of the Omen films. So growing up an atheist, he's not really exposed to religion, except for a few childhood experiences, mostly in the Anglican Church. It's kind of hard to escape in England, a national religion. You're required to sing hymns in school and participate in the Christmas nativity, and he knew the Lord's Prayer, but it was all very lifeless to him. And he talked about learning really early on that there were kind of two kinds of priests. There was the crusty old priest, who was kind of had a Victorian flair to him, dainty manners, speaking in kind of a dying tongue to kids who were just totally not interested. Like, they would come and give a sermon at his school, which I know is a strange idea in a public school, but something that would happen in England, and everybody would just kind of glaze over. And then he said, and then there was the trendy vicar, the trendy priest, who would incorporate all these pop culture references. He had a well-trimmed beard. He would sing folk songs on his guitar about how Jesus was his friend, and he would intersperse his sermons with Michael Jackson references. And he says in his article, despite his good intentions, the trendy vicar was much more worse than the stuffy vicar. At least the Victorian sermons were in some way otherworldly, as religion should be. If it was pop culture we wanted, and we did, we were better off sticking with the real thing, which is to say the thing without any Jesus in it. So religion was irrelevant to him at this point in his life. He described it as authoritarian, superstitious, feeble proto-science. It was the theft of precious free will by authorities who wanted to control people by telling them fairy tales. It repressed women, gay people, atheists, anyone who disobeyed its irrational edicts. It hated science, denied reason, burned witches and heretics by the millions. And he had realized that post-Enlightenment liberal societies had thrown off its shackles, and however hard both species of priests tried to prevent it, religion was dying a much-needed death at the hands of progress and reason, and he was happy to participate in that. And why not? He hadn't seen anything relevant in it. Where was the mystery? Where was the promised connection with God? Who was this God anyway? A man in the sky with a book of rules. And so it's time to move on. And as an atheist, he was happy to tell any and all that Christianity was rubbish. But he says, I kept visiting empty churches, I just didn't tell anyone. Paul's atheism first comes under threat in his late teens. His atheism mostly consists at this point of arguing with Christians and talking about their nonsense. But as he had a dad that just constantly took him on these walking trips. They would go for 12 days camping up in the English mountains in England and Wales. And he said, it was here that I had to admit that I could feel some deep old power rolling through it all, welding it together, flowing from the land into me and back again. It was here that he admitted that nothing humans could build could come close to the intense wonder and mystery of the natural world. The world was enchanted by something, and so his atheism wouldn't do, and it morphed into kind of an animism or a pantheism. There must be God here in these rocks, in this nature. And his animism and pantheism had to kind of work itself out in some kind of action, and so environmental activism quickly followed for him, and he begins to work for NGOs and write for magazines and march and occupy and chain himself to various natural objects because he really felt that anybody with eyes to see should be able to see what humanity was doing to the planet. And as he wrote and marched and championed these environmental causes, he became a student of the systems and the cultural forces that were ravaging the earth. Capitalism, industrialization, globalization were creating a world without limitations, a world where we could replace God with machine. And he said, my activism was a staging post on the road to realization. And what it was that he realized was that things like climate change and mass extinction are not problems to be solved through politics or technology or science, but they are the manifestation of a deep spiritual malaise. Even an atheist could see that attempts to play God would end in disaster. And so now Paul starts to dimly see something that he thought he should have seen much sooner, that the great spiritual pathways, the teachings of the saints and the gurus and the mystics and the vessels built to hold them, their religions, might have been there for a reason. They might have been there telling us something urgent about human nature and about what happens when our reach exceeds our grasp. So he goes searching for the truth. And he goes searching in New Age kind of gift shops, looking around at his options. And he finds tarot cards with cats on them and, different retreats that he can attend. And it isn't appealing to him. He only finds more of the same, a place to magnify his own will, not correct it, right? He realizes there's a spiritual problem here within me and within the world, and who's saying something about how this gets adjusted. And so he was longing for something that was ancient, something with more structure. It doesn't occur to him to go back to the crusty old vicar. He knew that Christianity, from what he knew about Christianity, was that, dominate and subdue the earth, had created something in the world where Christianity was more participant in the destruction of creation than vice versa. So when he turns 40, he goes on a week-long Zen Buddhist retreat, and for the next 5 or 6 years, he practices Zen and studies the teachings of the Buddha. And for a while, it meets his needs, and he finds meaningful spiritual practice and a connection to the natural world. And he says it was a serious spiritual path without the baggage of the church, which was nice. But as the years went on, Paul admitted that Zen was not enough. He said it was full of compassion, but it lacked love. It took him a long time to admit to himself what was really lacking, what he'd been afraid of admitting all along, that he wanted to worship. Something was calling him, but what? Obviously it wasn't Christ. He was a pagan anyway. He found God in nature, so he needed a nature religion. And this is how he ends up becoming a priest of the witch gods. Paul joins his local Wiccan coven and becomes a priest, and he gives himself to the whole thing. This is a brilliant guy, a truly brilliant person. And his coven used to do rituals in the woods under the full moon, initiatory rituals, magical teachings, spell work, protective circles, and at the center, something to worship. Finally, 2 deities, the great goddess and the horned god. At last, he was home. He was where he belonged, in the woods, worshiping a nature goddess under the stars. Everything seemed to fall in place until Paul started having dreams. And one night, Paul dreams of Jesus. He says, the dream was vivid, and when I woke up, I wrote down what I had heard Jesus say, and I drew what he had looked like. This was to be the next step on my spiritual path. I didn't believe it or want it to be true, but the image and the message reminded me of something strange that had happened a few months before. My wife and I were out to dinner celebrating our wedding anniversary when suddenly she says to me, "You're going to become a Christian." When he asked her what on earth she was talking about, she said she didn't know. She just had a feeling and needed to tell him. And she's not a Christian. And he says that she had a way of kind of doing this, of just kind of like having a premonition about things. And it shakes him, and he's like, me, a Christian, what could be weirder? And then he says, suddenly I start meeting Christians everywhere. They're coming out of the woodwork. Strangers emailing him out of the blue. Priests coming to him, asking him for help with their writing. Having conversations with friends he didn't even know were Christians before, and suddenly they just want to talk about it. And it keeps happening for months, and he says, Christ to the left of me, Christ to the right. It was unnerving. I turned away again and again, but every time I looked back, he was still there. I began to feel I was being hunted. I wanted it to stop, at least I thought I did. I had no interest in Christianity. I was a witch, a Zen witch, in fact, which I thought sounded pretty damned edgy. But I knew who was after me, and I knew it wasn't over. So one evening, he's sitting in the kitchen of the house in which his coven had its temple. And they're about to go in and conduct this really important ritual. And as they get up to leave, he feels violently ill. He's dizzy, he's sick, he's lightheaded, and everybody notices, and he sits down at the table, and everybody's kind of fussing over him. And he's just completely pale. And he says, I had this overwhelming feeling that I should not go into the temple. Even that he was being like physically prevented from going into the temple. And he says, someone was staging an intervention. And I just want to read you his words from here on out. After that, he writes, there was no escape. Like C.S. Lewis, I could not ignore the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. How much later was it that I was finally pinned down? I don't remember. I was at a concert at my son's music school. We were in a hotel function room full of children ready to play their instruments and proud parents ready to film them doing it. I was just walking to my chair when I was overcome entirely. Suddenly, I could see how everyone in the room was connected to everyone else. And I could see what was going on inside them and inside myself. I was overcome with a huge and inexplicable love, a great wave of empathy for everyone and everything. And it kept coming and coming until I had to stagger out of the room and sit down in the corridor outside. Everything was unchanged, and everything was new. And I knew what had happened and who had done it. And I knew that it was too late. I had just become a Christian. None of this is rationally explicable, and there is no point in arguing with me about it. There's no point in my arguing with myself about it. I gave up after a while. This is not to say that my faith is irrational. In fact, the more I learned, the more Christianity's story about the world and human nature chimed better with my experience than did the increasingly shaky claims of secular materialism. In the end, though, I didn't become a Christian because I could argue myself into it. I became a Christian because I knew suddenly that it was true. The Angelus that was chiming in the abyss is silent now, for the abyss is gone. Someone else inhabits me now. I grew up believing what all modern people are taught, that freedom meant lack of constraint. Orthodoxy taught me that this freedom was no freedom at all, but enslavement to the passions. A neat description of the first 30 years of my life. True freedom, it turns out, is to give up your will and follow God's, to deny yourself, to let it come. I am terrible at this, but at least now I understand the path. In the kingdom of man, the seas are ribboned with plastic, the forests are burning, the cities bulge with billionaires and tented camps, and still we kneel before the idol of the great God of economy as it grows and grows like a cancer cell. And what if this ancient faith is not an obstacle after all, but a way through? As we see the consequences of eating the forbidden fruit, of choosing power over humility, separation over communion, the stakes become clearer each day. Surrender or rebellion, sacrifice or conquest, death of the self or triumph of the will, the cross or the machine. We have always been offered the same choice. The gate is straight and the way is narrow, and maybe we will always fail to walk it. But is there any other road that leads home? And after I read this, it was so late at night. And my wife is asleep on the couch. I'm like, I have to read you something. It's really long. And she sat and listened to it. What a journey. From atheism to animism and pantheism to activism to Buddhism to Wicca to Christ. This is a journey. Following a journey of following the light finally to the place where it rests. This is a journey of epiphany. And I realize that's the bulk of my sermon, but I share Paul's journey as a story of encouragement. A story of encouragement that people are still being drawn to the light of Christ. But also a story, an example of what the pilgrim's journey is like. It's fascinating. Paul's journey hasn't stopped. He's riding and journeying into what it looks like for him to join others on the journey and carry the light of Christ. And he's asking the really, as you can imagine, this is not a guy who kind of giving in to easy answers. So he's going, what is the impact of me saying this about Jesus? What is the impact of my family living in this way? And he's doing really radical things because of it. My favorite verse from this chapter in Matthew comes at the end of the passage. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. They don't get to go home the way they came. It's not an out and back. It's not arrive and then just go back home. It's an arrive and then back out into the unknown. the journey continues. I love how Jan Richardson puts it in her poem on the Magi. This is where I'm going to end, I promise. She says this: "There is no reversing this road. The path that bore you here goes in one direction only. Every step drawing you down a way by which you will not return. You thought arrival was everything, that your entire journey ended with kneeling in the place you had spent all to find. When you laid down your gift, release came with such ease, your treasure tumbling from your hands in awe and benediction. Now the knowledge of your leaving comes like a stone laid over your heart, the familiar path closed, and not even the solace of a star to guide your way. You will set out in fear, you will set out in dream, but you will set out by that other road that lies in shadow and in dark. We cannot show you the route that will take you home. That way is yours and will be found in the walking. But we tell you, you will wonder at how the light you thought you had left behind goes with you, spilling from your empty hands, shimmering beneath your homeward feet, illuminating the road with every step you take." Jan's the best, by the way. Epiphany is about the journey of seeing the light, on getting your halo, so to speak, of having the light bulb turn on. Surely this is the Son of God. And then taking the light bulb with you into the dark on your journey onward. So like the wise men, may our response this morning to this light be worship, be generosity and praise. As we come to this table, may we celebrate the light of Christ as revealed so brilliantly in his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. May we affirm the light we have come to see and the light we carry with us as we go into the unknown. Amen.